Margaret Whitmore pressed her back against the rough bark of the oak tree, her breath coming in sharp gasps that seemed to echo through the Wyoming wilderness. The sound of hoofbeats grew fainter, but she didn't dare move yet. 3 days had passed since she'd escaped from the Hartwell gang, and her body ached from sleeping on hard ground and surviving on creek water and wild berries. Her once pristine traveling dress was now torn and stained, a far cry from the hopeful young woman who had boarded the stagecoach in Denver, with dreams of starting fresh in Oregon territory. The attack had happened so suddenly. One moment she was reading her late father's letter for the 100th time, the one that had prompted this journey west, and the next masked men on horseback were surrounding their coach. The driver, poor Mr. Anderson, had tried to reach for his rifle but was shot before he could defend them. The other passengers, a merchant named Bradley and an elderly couple, the Hendersons, had handed over their valuables without resistance. But when the leader, a scarred man with cold eyes, had grabbed Margaret's arm and declared she was coming with them, something fierce had awakened inside her. She had bitten his hand hard enough to draw blood and bolted into the dense forest while he cursed, and his men scrambled to follow. For 3 days now, she had been running, hiding, doubling back on her own trail, using every trick her brother Thomas had taught her during their childhood games of hide and seek back in Pennsylvania. But this wasn't a game anymore, and she was beginning to realize that her pursuers weren't giving up easily. A twig snapped somewhere behind her, and Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. She peered around the tree trunk, squinting through the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. Nothing moved except the gentle sway of pine branches in the morning breeze. Maybe it was just an animal, she told herself, though every instinct screamed that she was still being hunted. The Hartwell gang had a reputation that stretched across 3 territories, and she had heard whispered stories in saloons and general stores about their ruthlessness. They didn't leave witnesses, and they certainly didn't let valuable captives escape without a fight. Her stomach cramped with hunger, reminding her that the handful of huckleberries she'd found yesterday wasn't enough to sustain her much longer. She needed to find civilization, or at least someone who could help her get to the nearest town. But trust was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. Out here in the wilderness, anyone could be friend or foe, and her father's warnings about the dangers of the frontier echoed in her mind. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to summon the courage that had carried her this far. She thought of her brother Thomas, probably worried sick back home, and of the new life waiting for her in Oregon if she could just survive long enough to claim it. The sound of hoofbeats returned, closer this time, and Margaret knew her rest was over. She gathered her torn skirts and prepared to run again, not knowing that her salvation was riding toward her from the opposite direction. A lone cowboy named Jake Morrison had been tracking the same gang for reasons of his own, and their paths were about to cross in a way that would change both their lives forever. The morning sun climbed higher as Margaret took a deep breath and stepped deeper into the unknown wilderness, unaware that her greatest challenge and her greatest hope were both just hours away. Jake Morrison reined in his horse at the edge of the clearing, his weathered hands steady on the leather straps as he studied the disturbed ground before him. 20 years of tracking rustlers, outlaws, and lost cattle had taught him to read the wilderness like a book, and this particular story made his jaw clench with familiar anger. The hoofprints told him everything he needed to know: 5 horses, moving fast, with one set of tracks significantly lighter than the others. Boot prints scattered near a fallen log suggested someone had stopped here recently, someone small enough to be a woman or a child. He had been following the Hartwell gang for 6 weeks now, ever since they had raided the homestead outside Cheyenne, where his younger sister Emma lived with her husband and 2 small children. The memory of finding their burned cabin, of Emma's tears as she described how the outlaws had taken everything they owned and threatened worse if her husband tried to follow them, still burned in his chest like a brand. Jake had spent most of his adult life trying to leave his violent past behind, working honest jobs on cattle ranches and keeping to himself. But some things demanded action, and the Hartwell gang had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The tracks were fresh, maybe an hour old at most. Someone was running through these woods, and given what he knew about the gang's habits, it probably wasn't by choice. Jake's horse, a sturdy buckskin named Scout that had been his companion for 8 years, snorted softly and shifted restlessly beneath him. Animals could sense tension, and Scout knew his rider well enough to recognize the signs of an impending confrontation. Jake dismounted quietly, his boots making almost no sound on the forest floor. His father had been a tracker for the cavalry before settling down to ranch life, and he had passed on skills that had served Jake well over the years. Moving with practiced stealth, he followed the trail deeper into the woods, his hand resting casually on the grip of his Colt revolver. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he had learned long ago that trouble rarely asked permission before arriving. The sound of branches breaking somewhere ahead made him freeze. Someone was moving through the underbrush, and they weren't being particularly careful about staying quiet. Jake frowned, because that didn't match what he expected from the Hartwell gang. Those men were experienced outlaws who knew how to move silently when they needed to. This sounded more like someone crashing through the forest in desperation or panic. He tied Scout's reins to a low branch and continued on foot, his movements now completely silent as he closed the distance. Through a gap in the trees, he caught sight of movement, a flash of blue fabric that definitely didn't belong to any outlaw he had ever encountered. Jake's pulse quickened as he realized he might be looking at a victim rather than a perpetrator, someone who needed help rather than capture. The woman stumbled into view 30 yards ahead of him, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with dark hair that had come loose from whatever arrangement it had been in originally. Her dress was torn and dirty, and she moved with the exhausted gait of someone who had been running for far too long. But it was the determined set of her shoulders, and the way she kept glancing back over her shoulder that told him she wasn't giving up, no matter how desperate her situation had become. Jake made a decision that would change everything. Instead of revealing himself immediately, he began shadowing her movement, staying parallel to her path while remaining hidden in the trees. If the Hartwell gang was still pursuing her, he wanted to know exactly what he was dealing with before making his presence known. Margaret's legs trembled with exhaustion as she pushed through another tangle of brambles, the thorns catching at her already ruined dress and adding fresh scratches to her arms. She had lost track of how long she had been moving, but the sun was well past its peak now, casting longer shadows through the forest that would make it even easier for her pursuers to hide. Every sound made her jump: the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant call of a hawk, the crack of settling wood somewhere in the darkness beneath the canopy. She paused beside a fallen log to catch her breath, pressing one hand to the stitch in her side while scanning the forest around her. The trees seemed to go on forever in every direction, an endless maze of pine and oak and underbrush that could hide a dozen men or lead her in circles until she collapsed from exhaustion. Back in Pennsylvania, she had always been good at outdoor activities, accompanying Thomas on hunting trips and helping her father with farm work that kept her strong and capable. But this was different. This was survival, pure and simple, and she was beginning to understand why so many people never made it out of the western wilderness alive. A horse whinnied somewhere behind her, the sound carrying clearly through the still air, and Margaret's blood turned to ice. They had found her trail again. She could hear voices now, rough male voices that carried the easy confidence of men who knew they held all the advantages in this deadly game of chase. One of them laughed, a sound that made her skin crawl, and she recognized it as belonging to the scarred leader who had grabbed her arm 3 days ago. "She can't have gotten far," the voice called out, and Margaret realized with growing horror that they were close enough for her to make out individual words. "Tracks are fresh here. Spread out and check every tree, every rock. She's got to be getting tired by now." Margaret looked around desperately for somewhere to hide, but the forest offered no obvious sanctuary. The fallen log was too small to conceal her completely, and the nearest large tree was 20 yards away across open ground. She could try to run again, but her legs felt like water, and she wasn't sure she could maintain the pace needed to stay ahead of mounted men. For the first time since her escape, true despair began to creep into her thoughts. That was when she saw him, a tall figure moving silently through the trees about 50 yards to her left, keeping pace with her movement but staying carefully hidden. For a terrifying moment, she thought it might be another member of the gang, someone who had circled around to cut off her escape. But something about the way he moved, the deliberate care he took to remain concealed, suggested something different. This man wasn't trying to catch her. He was following her, protecting her flanks like a guardian angel she hadn't known she needed. Their eyes met across the distance, and Margaret felt a shock of recognition that had nothing to do with having seen him before. He was younger than she had expected, probably in his early 30s, with dark hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything around them. His clothing marked him as a working cowboy: practical boots, worn leather chaps, a hat that had seen years of sun and weather. But it was his face that caught her attention, the strong jawline and steady gaze that somehow conveyed both competence and compassion even at this distance. He raised one finger to his lips in a gesture for silence, then pointed toward a dense thicket of bushes about 20 yards to her right. Margaret understood immediately. He was directing her toward better cover, giving her a chance to hide while he dealt with whatever was coming. She nodded once to show she understood, then began moving as quietly as she could toward the indicated hiding spot. Behind her, the voices were getting closer, and she could hear the sound of horses picking their way carefully through the underbrush. Her mysterious protector had disappeared again, melting back into the forest like a ghost, but somehow his presence had given her the first real hope she had felt in days. Jake positioned himself behind a massive pine tree that provided perfect cover while giving him clear sightlines in 3 directions. He had counted 4 distinct voices so far, which meant at least one member of the gang was unaccounted for, either staying with their horses or circling around to flank their quarry. The woman had reached the thicket he had indicated and was now completely hidden from view, which gave him the tactical advantage he needed to assess the situation properly. The first rider came into view about 60 yards away, a thin man with a patchy beard who sat his horse with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to being the hunter rather than the hunted. Jake recognized him from wanted posters as Billy Crane, a small-time rustler who had thrown in with the Hartwell gang about 2 years ago. The man's rifle was across his saddle, ready but not immediately threatening, which suggested they still thought they were chasing an unarmed woman through the woods. "Found something here," another voice called from Jake's left, and he shifted position slightly to get a better view. This one was older, heavily built, with the kind of scarred hands that came from years of hard living and harder choices. "Looks like she stopped to rest. Trail gets real clear heading east from here." Jake smiled grimly. The woman was smarter than her pursuers realized. She had deliberately left obvious sign leading away from her actual hiding place, a trick that might buy them precious time if these men were careless enough to follow the false trail. But the gang's leader wasn't careless, and Jake could hear the sound of more horses approaching from the north. "Don't be idiots," a harsh voice commanded, and Jake's jaw tightened as he recognized Marcus Hartwell himself. The gang leader was a tall man with a distinctive scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a souvenir from a knife fight in a Tombstone saloon that had left his opponent dead, and Hartwell with a permanent reminder of his own mortality. "She's trying to throw us off. Billy, you and Rogers follow that trail, but don't go more than 100 yards. If you don't find fresh sign, double back here. She's close, I can feel it." Jake's hand moved instinctively to his gun as he calculated distances and angles. 4 men, all armed, all experienced in violence and intimidation. Under normal circumstances, he would have tried to avoid a confrontation. 4 against 1 weren't odds that any sensible man would choose. But circumstances weren't normal, and leaving an innocent woman to whatever fate these men had planned wasn't an option he could live with. The sound of approaching hoofbeats told him the fifth gang member was finally making his appearance, completing the picture Jake needed to plan his next move. He had 2 advantages working in his favor: surprise, and the moral certainty that came from knowing he was fighting for something more important than money or revenge. The Hartwell gang had terrorized honest people across 3 territories for too long, and today that reign of terror was going to end. Jake pulled his Colt and checked the cylinder out of habit, though he knew perfectly well that all 6 chambers were loaded and ready. The weight of the gun in his hand felt familiar and comforting, like greeting an old friend after a long absence. He had hoped to leave this part of his life behind, but some things couldn't be avoided forever. Sometimes a man had to stand up and fight, not because he wanted to, but because it was the right thing to do. Through the trees, he could see movement as the gang spread out to search the area more systematically. They were being thorough now, checking every potential hiding place with the patience of men who knew their quarry couldn't run much farther. Jake waited until they were positioned exactly where he wanted them, then stepped out from behind the pine tree with his gun drawn and ready. "That's far enough, gentlemen," he called out in a voice that carried clearly through the forest air. The effect of Jake's appearance was immediate and electric. 4 of the 5 gang members spun toward the sound of his voice, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons, while Marcus Hartwell himself remained perfectly still on his horse, his cold eyes assessing this new threat with the calculating patience of a predator who had survived too many dangerous encounters to panic easily. "Well, well," Hartwell said slowly, his scarred mouth curving into something that might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. "Looks like we got ourselves a hero, boys. You picked a real bad day to play Good Samaritan, stranger. Why don't you just turn around and ride away, pretend you never saw us, and maybe you'll live to see another sunset?" Jake kept his gun trained on the gang leader while using his peripheral vision to track the movement of the other men. Two of them had managed to draw their weapons, but they were hesitating, probably trying to figure out if one man really posed enough threat to worry about. The smart ones would be looking for cover right about now, but greed and overconfidence had made them careless. "I don't think so," Jake replied calmly. "You boys have been having way too much fun terrorizing innocent folks. Time someone reminded you that actions have consequences." Billy Crane, the thin man with the patchy beard, decided to test Jake's resolve by spurring his horse forward while reaching for his rifle. It was a fatal mistake. Jake's colt barked once, the sound echoing through the forest like thunder, and Crane tumbled backward off his horse with a cry of pain and surprise. The bullet had taken him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying into the underbrush. "Anyone else feeling lucky today?" Jake asked, his voice still perfectly steady as he smoothly shifted his aim to cover the remaining threats. The gang scattered like startled quail, diving for cover behind trees and fallen logs while shouting curses and threats. Jake had expected this reaction, and he was already moving before their boots hit the ground, using the massive pine tree as mobile cover, while he repositioned himself to maintain tactical advantage. The key to surviving a gunfight against multiple opponents was never to stay in one place long enough for them to coordinate their fire. Bullets began flying, chunks of bark exploding from trees around him as the outlaws tried to pin him down. Jake responded with carefully aimed shots, not trying to kill unless he had to, but making sure each bullet found its mark. His second shot shattered the stock of a rifle just as its owner was bringing it to bear, while his third punched through the crown of a hat and convinced its wearer to reconsider his life choices. From her hiding place in the thicket, Margaret watched the gunfight unfold with a mixture of terror and amazement. The mysterious cowboy moved through the forest like he had been born there, using every tree and rock for cover while methodically dismantling the gang that had terrorized her for 3 days. She had never seen anyone fight with such calm precision, as if this deadly dance was just another day's work for him. Marcus Hartwell had taken cover behind a large boulder and was trying to work his way around to Jake's flank, his own gun glinting in the dappled sunlight. Margaret realized with growing alarm that the gang leader was positioning himself for a shot that Jake wouldn't see coming, and she knew she had to do something to help the man who was risking his life for her. Without stopping to think about the consequences, Margaret picked up a fallen branch and hurled it as hard as she could toward Hartwell's position. The branch crashed through the underbrush about 10 feet from the gang leader, making enough noise to draw his attention and spoil his careful aim. Hartwell spun toward the sound, his gun tracking automatically, and in that moment of distraction Jake appeared like an avenging angel with his Colt aimed directly at the outlaw's chest. "Drop it, Hartwell," Jake commanded, and for the first time since the fight began, his voice carried the cold edge of a man who had reached the end of his patience. Marcus Hartwell froze with his gun halfway raised, intelligent enough to recognize that his tactical situation had just shifted dramatically. The mysterious cowboy had him dead to rights, and they both knew it. Around them, the forest had fallen into an unnatural silence broken only by the groans of wounded gang members and the nervous shifting of horses that had scattered during the gunfight. "You know who I am," Hartwell said, lowering his weapon slowly but not dropping it completely. "That means you know what kind of reputation I carry in these parts. Kill me, and my boys will hunt you to the ends of the earth. There's no place you'll be safe, no town where you can hide." Jake's expression didn't change, but Margaret could see his finger tighten slightly on the trigger. "Your boys are going to be too busy explaining themselves to federal marshals to worry about hunting anybody. And your reputation doesn't scare me much, considering you make war on innocent women and hardworking families." "That woman ain't as innocent as she looks," Hartwell snarled, jerking his head in Margaret's general direction. "She's carrying something that belongs to me, something I paid good money for. This is just a business transaction that got complicated." Margaret felt her blood run cold as she realized what Hartwell was implying. The other passengers on the stagecoach had mentioned rumors about women being sold to mining camps and frontier brothels, but she had dismissed such talk as the kind of wild stories that grew in the telling. Now, she understood that her escape had prevented something far worse than simple robbery. "The only business you're going to be conducting is with a federal judge," Jake replied, his gun never wavering. "Now drop that iron before I lose what's left of my patience." For a moment, it looked like Hartwell might comply. His gun hand lowered another few inches, and Margaret began to hope that this nightmare might end without more bloodshed. But she had underestimated the gang leader's desperation and cunning. In one fluid motion, Hartwell dove sideways while bringing his gun up to fire, gambling that he could get a shot off before Jake could react. He was wrong. Jake's Colt spoke twice in rapid succession, both bullets finding their target with the kind of precision that came from years of practice and perfect calm under pressure. Hartwell's gun flew from his hand as he spun and fell, crying out in pain as he hit the ground hard. The gang leader clutched his right shoulder while glaring up at his opponent with naked hatred. "You made your choice," Jake said quietly, moving forward to kick Hartwell's gun well out of reach. "Now you get to live with the consequences." The remaining gang members had lost all appetite for fighting after watching their leader go down. One by one, they emerged from cover with their hands raised, recognizing that their situation had become hopeless. Jake kept them covered while quickly assessing the tactical situation. 3 men wounded but not seriously. one leader down but still breathing, and one woman who had shown remarkable courage under impossible circumstances. "Ma'am," Jake called out without taking his eyes off the prisoners, "it's safe to come out now. These gentlemen have decided to surrender." Margaret emerged from the thicket on unsteady legs, hardly able to believe that her ordeal was finally over. The mysterious cowboy who had saved her life stood with his back to her, still holding his gun on the defeated outlaws, and she realized she didn't even know his name. For 3 days, she had been running for her life, and now a complete stranger had risked everything to protect her. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to repay you for what you've done." Jake glanced over his shoulder at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip, not just competence and courage, but genuine kindness and concern for her welfare. "No payment necessary, ma'am. Just doing what any decent man would do." But Margaret knew better. In 3 days of running through the wilderness, she had learned that the frontier was a place where decent men were rarer than gold and infinitely more valuable. Jake methodically went about the business of securing his prisoners, using rope from his saddlebags to bind their hands while keeping a careful eye on their wounds. None of the injuries were life-threatening, but Billy Crane would need medical attention soon if he was going to keep full use of his shoulder. The others had suffered minor gunshot wounds, and the kind of bruises that came from diving behind rocks and trees during a firefight. "What's your name, stranger?" Marcus Hartwell asked through gritted teeth as Jake checked the knots on his bindings. "A man's got a right to know who shot him." "Jake Morrison," came the reply, and Margaret noticed that her rescuer didn't seem particularly concerned about keeping his identity secret. "I've been tracking you boys for 6 weeks now, ever since you decided to pay a visit to my sister's homestead outside Cheyenne." Hartwell's scarred face went pale as he made the connection. "Emma Morrison, pretty little thing with 2 young ones. We didn't hurt them none, just took what we needed to survive. This is frontier justice, not personal revenge." Jake's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "My sister and her family lost everything they had worked 5 years to build. Her children went hungry because of what you took, and her husband couldn't work for 2 weeks because of the beating you gave him. That makes it plenty personal." Margaret listened to this exchange with growing understanding. The man who had saved her life wasn't just a random Good Samaritan. He was on a mission of justice for his own family, and her rescue had been an unexpected complication in a larger story of right and wrong. The knowledge made her feel simultaneously grateful and guilty, wondering if her presence had put him in additional danger. "Ma'am," Jake said, turning his attention to her while keeping his prisoners in sight, "I need to know your name and how you came to be running through these woods. There'll be questions when we get to town, and the marshal will want a full accounting of what happened here." Margaret Whitmore, she replied, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded after everything she had been through. I was traveling to Oregon Territory when these men attacked our stagecoach 3 days ago. They killed the driver and took the other passengers prisoner, but I managed to escape into the forest. Jake nodded grimly. Any idea what happened to the other folks who were with you? Margaret's heart sank as she realized she had been so focused on her own survival that she hadn't spared much thought for her fellow travelers. There was a merchant named Bradley and an elderly couple, the Hendersons. I don't know if they're still alive. We'll find out when we get these boys to the authorities, Jake assured her. Right now, the important thing is getting you somewhere safe. You've been through enough. As if to emphasize his point, Margaret's knees suddenly buckled as the adrenaline that had sustained her through the gunfight finally wore off. Jake moved quickly to steady her, his strong hands gentle but sure as he helped her sit down on a fallen log. Up close, she could see the concern in his dark eyes and smell the scent of leather and horses that clung to his clothes. "When's the last time you ate anything?" he asked, already reaching for his saddle bags. "2 days ago, I think," Margaret admitted, accepting the piece of jerky and hardtack he offered with grateful hands. "I've been living on berries and creek water since I escaped." Jake's expression darkened as he looked at the bound outlaws. "3 days these animals have been hunting you through the wilderness, and they never once considered that you might starve or die of exposure. Makes a man wonder what kind of monsters we're sharing the world with." Margaret took a small bite of the jerky, her stomach cramping with hunger despite her exhaustion. "What happens now? How far are we from the nearest town?" "Cedar Falls is about 12 miles northwest of here," Jake replied, checking the position of the sun. "We can make it before dark if we start soon. I'll load these boys on their horses and we'll all ride in together. The marshal there is a good man named Tom Bradley. He'll see that justice gets done." For some reason, the mention of starting their journey made Margaret feel suddenly anxious. For 3 days, Jake Morrison had been her unseen guardian angel, and now he was about to become her very real protector for the next phase of this ordeal. She found herself studying his face, trying to read the character behind those steady dark eyes. Jake whistled sharply, and within minutes his buckskin horse came trotting through the trees, followed by several of the gang's mounts that had been scattered during the gunfight. The animals had been well trained not to wander far during conflicts, a practical consideration for men who lived by violence and needed reliable transportation for quick escapes. "Easy there, Scout," Jake murmured to his horse, running a practiced hand along the animal's neck to check for any injuries from stray bullets. The buckskin snorted softly and nuzzled his owner's shoulder, clearly relieved to be reunited after the excitement. Margaret watched this interaction with interest, noting how gentle Jake was with his horse despite the deadly efficiency he had displayed during the gunfight. There was something reassuring about a man who treated animals with kindness. Her father had always said you could judge a person's character by how they behaved toward creatures that couldn't defend themselves. "Can you ride, Miss Whitmore?" Jake asked, leading a relatively calm-looking mare toward her. "This one belongs to Billy Crane, but she seems gentle enough for a lady." Margaret nodded, though privately she wondered if her exhausted legs would be able to maintain their grip in a saddle for 12 miles. She had ridden regularly back in Pennsylvania, but that had been for pleasure on familiar trails, not survival transportation through rough wilderness terrain. Still, walking was clearly not an option with wounded prisoners to transport and darkness approaching. Jake helped her mount the mare, his hands steady and respectful as he adjusted the stirrups for her shorter legs. The contact was brief and entirely proper, but Margaret found herself acutely aware of his strength and competence. This was a man who knew how to take care of people, she realized, someone who could be trusted to keep his word and honor his commitments. "Billy's going to need a doctor soon," Jake observed, checking on the wounded outlaw who was slumped over his horse's neck. "That shoulder's bleeding more than I'd like to see." "Maybe you should have thought of that before you shot me," Crane muttered through clenched teeth. Jake's expression didn't change. "Maybe you should have thought of that before you drew on me. Actions have consequences, friend. That's a lesson you boys never seem to learn." The small procession set out through the forest with Jake in the lead, followed by Margaret, then the bound prisoners, with Jake frequently checking over his shoulder to make sure everyone was still mounted and accounted for. The pace was necessarily slow due to the wounded men and Margaret's exhaustion, but Jake seemed content to take his time and ensure everyone's safety. As they rode, Margaret found herself studying her rescuer's profile, trying to understand the man who had risked his life for a complete stranger. There was something in his bearing that suggested military experience or extensive time in dangerous situations. The way he constantly scanned their surroundings, the casual competence with which he handled his weapons, the natural authority that made even hardened outlaws respect his commands. "Mr. Morrison," she said during a rest stop beside a small creek, "may I ask what you do when you're not hunting down criminals?" Jake smiled, the expression transforming his serious face and making him look younger and more approachable. "I work cattle ranches mostly, ma'am. Been doing it for about 15 years now, ever since I left the Army. It's honest work and it keeps me outdoors where I belong." "The Army," Margaret repeated, filing away this piece of information. "That explains a lot about how you handled yourself back there." "Sometimes the skills come in handy," Jake admitted, "though I'd prefer to live in a world where they weren't necessary." Margaret found herself wondering what other skills Jake Morrison possessed, and what kind of life he had built for himself in this wild country. More importantly, she wondered what would happen to their unlikely partnership once they reached Cedar Falls, and he turned his prisoners over to the authorities. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains when the small town of Cedar Falls finally came into view, its wooden buildings and scattered lanterns looking like the most beautiful sight Margaret had ever seen. After 4 days in the wilderness, the prospect of a real bed, hot food, and safety from pursuit seemed almost too good to be true. Jake rode directly to the marshal's office, a sturdy building that sat prominently on the town's main street. Word of their arrival had already spread, and curious townspeople were gathering on the wooden sidewalks to get a look at the famous Hartwell gang and the man who had finally brought them to justice. Marshal Tom Bradley emerged from his office as they approached, a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of steady demeanor that came from years of dealing with frontier justice. His badge caught the lamplight as he stepped into the street to greet them. "Jake Morrison," the marshal said with obvious relief. "I was starting to wonder if you'd gotten yourself killed chasing after these boys. Looks like you had better luck than I expected." "Evening, Tom," Jake replied, dismounting and helping Margaret down from her horse. "Got a delivery for you, plus a lady who's been through considerable hardship. Miss Margaret Whitmore, this is Marshal Bradley. He's the man who's going to make sure these criminals face proper justice." Marshal Bradley tipped his hat to Margaret with old-fashioned courtesy. "Miss Whitmore, I'm sorry for whatever ordeal you've endured. We'll get you settled at the hotel and take your statement in the morning when you've had a chance to rest and recover." Margaret felt a wave of relief so powerful it made her knees weak. After days of running and hiding, the simple promise of safety and rest seemed like the greatest gift anyone had ever offered her. "Thank you, Marshal. I'm grateful for your kindness." Jake and the marshal worked together to transfer the prisoners to the jail cells, with Billy Crane being taken directly to the town doctor for treatment of his shoulder wound. Marcus Hartwell maintained his sullen silence, but Margaret could see the hatred burning in his eyes as he was locked behind bars. Even defeated and wounded, the gang leader remained dangerous, and she shuddered to think what might have happened if Jake hadn't appeared when he did. "Jake," Marshal Bradley said quietly as they finished securing the prisoners, "there's been some development since you left town. Got word from the territorial capital that there's a federal bounty on these boys, $500 each, dead or alive. That's $2,500 waiting for you, plus whatever reward money the railroad and stagecoach companies are offering." Jake nodded absently, his attention focused on Margaret rather than the prospect of reward money. She was swaying on her feet with exhaustion, and he could see that she was running purely on willpower at this point. The adrenaline that had carried her through the rescue and the ride to town was finally wearing off completely. "Miss Whitmore," Jake said gently, "let me escort you to the hotel. You need food and rest more than anything else right now." Margaret looked up at him with gratitude and something else, an expression that made Jake's chest tighten with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. This brave, determined woman had survived an ordeal that would have broken many people, and she had done it with a grace and courage that commanded his deepest respect. As they walked across the street to the Cedar Falls Hotel, Margaret found herself reluctant to say goodbye to the man who had saved her life. Tomorrow, she supposed, he would collect his bounties and return to whatever life he had been living before their paths crossed. The thought filled her with an unexpected sadness that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the growing realization that Jake Morrison was the kind of man she had never expected to find on the frontier. The Cedar Falls Hotel was a modest but clean establishment that catered primarily to travelers passing through on their way to Oregon Territory or California. The proprietor, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Henderson, took one look at Margaret's bedraggled appearance and immediately began fussing over her like a mother hen. "Oh, you poor dear," Mrs. Henderson exclaimed, ushering Margaret toward the stairs. "I've got a lovely room on the second floor with a proper bath and clean linens. Don't you worry about anything. We'll have you feeling human again in no time."